Okay, welcome back. In this episode of Prophecy Reformation now, we will be going through history because as we have learned, prophecy, God-given prophecy, is history in advance. So we find prophecy fulfilled in history. It is very important, before you can understand prophecy, you must understand history so that you can find your place in the prophecy. And so we're continuing to go through the history of Protestantism. I'm recording these live on air, and also they will be edited later on for Audible. So, and we will be posting these after they're edited back on Rumble. So there's a Rumble page, a playlist page there for the history of Protestantism if you want to get back to the beginning and follow the whole series from the beginning. You can do that instead of joining me live every day, or join me live every day and you can catch up. Also, these are available if you go to crosstheborder.org. That takes you to our free bookstore page. These aren't free yet because the free version is what I'm recording now. And so that will be free and remain free. But when it's done, it will also be available at Amazon and Audible. So if we have anything on Audible, it's preferable that you listen to it on Audible if you have an Audible account. That way it helps to support our work here. Anyway, let's jump into what chapter is it we left off at. Let me change this here, change our screen. And this is a slideshow that if you're watching on the video live, there's a slideshow of the pictures that appear in the volume that we're in. Each volume has, since there's 5 volumes and 24 books in the entire series, there's 7 books in this volume. So it's all the pictures from all the books, not just the book we're in. And right now we're in book 2 on Wickliffe. Wickliffe, chapter 11, Wickliffe and Transubstantiation. Wickliffe Old continues the war, attacks Transubstantiation, history of the dogma, Wycliffe's doctrine on the Eucharist, condemned by the University Court. Wickliffe appeals to the King and Parliament, and retires to Lutterworth. The insurrection of Wat Tyler. The primate Sudbury beheaded. Courtenay elected primate. He cites Wickliffe before him. The synod at Blackfriars. An earthquake. The primate reassures the terrified bishops. Wycliffe's doctrine on the Eucharist condemned. The primate gains over the king. The first persecuting edict. Wycliffe's friends fall away. Did the reformer now rest? He was old and sickly and needed repose. His day had been a stormy one. Sweet it were, at its eventide to taste a little quiet. But no, he panted, if it were possible, and if God were willing, to see his country's emancipation completed, and England a reformed land, before closing his eyes and descending into his grave. It was, he felt, a day of visitation. That day had come first of all to England. Oh, that she were wise, and that in her day she knew these things that belonged to her peace. If not, she might have to bury, with many tears and much blood, through years, and it might be centuries, of conflict, what seemed now so nearly within her reach. Wycliffe resolved, therefore, that there should be no pause in the war. He had just ended one battle. He now girded himself for another. He turned to attack the doctrinal system of the Church of Rome. He had come by this to be of opinion that the system of Rome's doctrines and the ceremonies of her worship were anti-Christian, a new religion founded of sinful men, and opposed to the rule of Jesus Christ given by him to his apostles. But in beginning this new battle, he selected one particular dogma as the object of attack. That dogma was transubstantiation. It is here that the superstition of Rome culminates. It is in this more than any other dogma that we find the sources of her prodigious authority and the springs of her vast influence. In making his blow to fall here, Wycliffe knew that the stroke would have tenfold more effect than if he directed it against a less vital part of the system. If he could abolish the sacrifice of the priest, he would bring back the sacrifice of Christ, which alone is the gospel, because through it is the remission of sins and the life everlasting. Transubstantiation, as we have already shown, was invented by the monk Paschasius Radbertus in the 9th century. It came into England in the train of William the Conqueror and his Anglo-Norman priests. It was zealously preached by Lanfranc, a Benedictine monk and abbot of St. Stephen of Caen in Normandy, who was raised to the see of Canterbury under William. And from the time of Lanfranc to the days of Wickliffe, this tenet was received by the Anglo-Norman clergy of England. It was hardly to be expected that they would very narrowly or critically examine the foundations of doctrine which contributed so greatly to their power. And as regards the laity of those days, it was enough for them, if they had the word of the Church, that this doctrine was true. In the spring of 1381, Wickliffe posted up at Oxford 12 propositions, denying the dogma of transubstantiation, and challenging all of the contrary opinion to debate the matter with him. The first of these propositions was as follows: the consecrated host, which we see upon the altar, is neither Christ nor any part of him, but an efficacious sign of him. He admitted that the words of consecration invest the elements with a mysterious and venerable character, but they do in no wise change their substance. The bread and wine are as really bread and wine after as before their consecration. Christ, he goes on to reason, called the elements bread and my body. They were bread, and they were Christ's body, as he himself is very man and very God, without any commingling of the two natures. So the elements are bread and Christ's body, bread really, and Christ's body figuratively and spiritually. Such, in brief, is what Wickliffe avowed as his opinion on the Eucharist at the commencement of the controversy, and on this ground he continued to stand all throughout it. Great was the commotion at Oxford. There were astonished looks, there was a buzz of talk, and heads were laid close together in earnest and subdued conversation. But no one accepted the challenge of Wickliffe. All shouted heresy. On that point there was a clear unanimity of opinion, but no one ventured to prove it, or to the only man in Oxford who needed to have it proved to him. The Chancellor of the University, William de Barton, summoned a council of 12, 4 secular doctors and 8 monks. The council unanimously condemned Wycliffe's opinion as heretical, and threatened diverse heavy penalties against anyone who should teach it in the university or listen to the teaching of it. The council, summoned in haste, met, it would seem, in comparative secrecy, for Wickliffe knew nothing of what was going on. He was in his classroom expounding to his students the true nature of the Eucharist when the door opened, and a delegate from the council made his appearance in the hall. He held in his hand the sentences of the doctors, which he proceeded to read. It enjoined silence on Wickliffe as regarded his opinion on transubstantiation, under pain of imprisonment, suspension from all scholastic functions, and the greater excommunication. This was tantamount to his expulsion from the university. But, interposed Wickliffe, you ought first to have shown me that I am in error. The only response was to be reminded of the sentence of the court, to which he was told he must submit himself or take the penalty. Then, said Wickliffe, I appeal to the king and the Parliament. But some time was to elapse before Parliament should meet, and meanwhile the reformer, watched and fettered in his chair, thought best to withdraw to Lutterworth. The jurisdiction of the chancellor of the university could not follow him to his parish. He passed a few quiet months ministering the true bread to his loving flock, being all the more anxious, since he could no longer make his voice heard at Oxford, to diffuse through his pulpit and by his pen those blessed truths which he had drawn from the fountains of revelation. He needed, moreover, this heavenly bread for his own support. "Come aside with me and rest awhile," was the language of this providence. In communion with his master he would efface the pain of past conflicts and arm himself for new ones. His way hitherto had been far from smooth, but what remained of it was likely to be even rougher. This, however, should be as God willed. One thing he knew, and oh, how transporting the thought, that he should find a quiet home at the end of it. New and unexpected clouds now gathered in the sky. Before Wickliffe could prosecute his appeal in Parliament, an insurrection broke out in England. The causes of the issues of that insurrection do not here concern us, farther than they bore on the fate of the reformer. Wat Tyler and a priest of the name of John Ball traversed England, rousing the passions of the populace with fiery harangues preached from the text they had written upon their banners. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? These tumults were not confined to England. They extended to France and other continental countries, and like the sudden yawning of a gulf, they show us the inner condition of society in the 14th century, how different from its surface. The theater of wars and pageants, which alone the historian thinks it worth his while to paint. There was nothing in the teaching of Wycliffe to minister stimulus to such ebullitions of popular wrath, yet it suited his enemies to lay them at his door and say, "See what comes of permitting these strange and demoralizing doctrines to be taught." It were a wholly superfluous task to vindicate Wycliffe or the gospel on this score, but in one way these events did connect themselves with the reformer. The mob apprehended Sudbury, the primate, and beheaded him. Courtenay, the bitter enemy of Wycliffe, was installed in the vacant see, and now we look for more decisive measures against him. Yet God, by what seemed an oversight at Rome, shielded the venerable reformer. The bull appointing Courtenay to the primacy arrived, but the pall did not come with it. The pall, it is well known, is the most essential of all those badges and insignia by which the Pope conveys to bishops the authority to act under him. Courtenay was too obedient a son of the Pope knowingly to transgress one of the least of his father's commandments. He burned with impatience to strike the head of heresy in England, but his scrupulous conscience would not permit him to proceed even against Wickliffe till the pall had given him full investiture with office. Hence the refreshing quiet and spiritual solace which the reformer continued to enjoy at his country rectory. It was now that Wickliffe shot another bolt. The wicket. At last the pall arrived. The primate, in possession of the mysterious and potent symbol, could now exercise the full powers of his great office. He immediately convoked a synod to try the Rector of Lutterworth. The court met on the 17th of May, 1382, in a place of evil augury. When we take into account with whom Wycliffe's life battle had been waged, the monastery of Blackfriars, London, the judges were assembled, including 8 prelates, 14 doctors of the canon and of the civil law, 6 bachelors of divinity, 4 monks, and 15 mendicant friars. They had taken their seats and were proceeding to business, when an ominous sound filled the air, and the building in which they were assembled began to rock. The monastery and all the city of London were shaken by an earthquake. Startled and terrified, the members of the court, turning to the president, demanded an adjournment. It did seem as if the stars in then courses were fighting against the primate. On the first occasion on which he summoned Wickliffe before him, the populace forced their way into the hall, and the court broke up in confusion. The same thing happened over again on the second occasion on which Wickliffe came to his bar. A popular tempest broke over the court, and the judges were driven from the judgment seat. A third time Wickliffe is summoned, and the court meets in a place where it was easier to take precaution against interference from the populace, when lo, the ground is suddenly rocked by an earthquake. But Courtenay had now got his paw from Rome, and was above these weak fears. So turning to his brother judges, he delivered to them a short homily on the earthly uses and mystic meanings of earthquakes, and bade them to be of good courage and go on. This earthquake, said he, portends the purging of the kingdom from heresies, for as there are shut up in the bowels of the earth many noxious spirits, which are expelled in an earthquake, and so the earth is cleansed, but not without great violence. So there are many heresies shut up in the hearts of reprobate men, but by the condemnation of them the kingdom is to be cleansed, but not without irksomeness and great commotion. The court, accepting on the archbishop's authority the earthquake as a good omen, went on with the trial of Wickliffe. An officer of the court read out 26 propositions selected from the writings of the Reformer. The court sat 3 days in good deliberation over them. It unanimously condemned 10 of them as heretical, and the remainder as erroneous. Among those specially branded as heresies were the propositions relating to transubstantiation, the temporal emoluments of the hierarchy, and the supremacy of the Pope, which last Wickliffe admitted might be deduced from the emperor, but certainly not from Christ. The sentence of the court was to send the Bishop of London and all of his brethren, the suffragans of the diocese of Canterbury, and also the Bishop of Lincoln, Wycliffe's diocesan, accompanied by the commands of Courtenay, as primate of all England, that they should look to it that these pestiferous doctrines were not taught in their dioceses. Besides these 2 missives, a third was dispatched to the University of Oxford, which was, in the primate's eyes, nothing better than a hotbed of heresy. The Chancellor, William de Barton, who presided over the court that condemned Wickliffe the year before, was dead, and his office was now filled by Robert Rigg, who was friendly to the Reformer. Among the professors and students were many who had imbibed the sentiments of Wickliffe, and needed to be warned against the venomous serpent, to whose seductions they had already begun to listen. When the primate saw that his counsel did not find the ready ear which he thought it entitled to from that learned body, but that, on the contrary, they continued to toy with the danger, he resolved to save them in spite of themselves. He carried his complaint to the young king, Richard II. If we permit this heretic, he said, to appeal continually to the passions of the people, our destruction is inevitable. We must silence these lollards. The king was gained over. He gave authority to confine in the prisons of the state any who should maintain the condemned propositions. The Reformation was advancing, but it appeared at this moment as if the Reformer was on the eve of being crushed. He had many friends. Every day was adding to their number, but they lacked courage and remained in the background. His lectures at Oxford had planted the gospel in the schools. The Bible which he had translated was planting it in the homes of England. But if the disciples of the Reformation multiplied, so too did the foes of the Reformer. The hierarchy had all along withstood and persecuted him. Now the mailed hand of the king was raised to strike him. When this was seen, all his friends fell away from him. John of Gaunt had deserted him at an earlier stage. This prince stood stoutly by Wickliffe so long as the Reformer occupied himself in simply repelling encroachments of the hierarchy upon the prerogatives of the crown and independence of the nation. That was a branch of the controversy the Duke could understand. But when it passed into the doctrinal sphere, when the bold reformer, not content with cropping off a few branches, began to lay the axe to the root, to deny the sacrament and abolish the altar, the valiant prince was alarmed. He felt that he had stepped on ground which he did not know, and that he was in danger of being drawn into a bottomless pit of heresy. John of Gaunt, therefore, made all haste to draw off. But others, too, of whom better things might have been expected, quailed before the gathering storm, and stood aloof from the reformer. Dr. Nicholas Hereford, who had aided him in translating the Old Testament, and John Ashton, the most eloquent of those preachers whom Wycliffe had sent forth to traverse England, consulted their own safety rather than the defense of their leader, and the honor of the cause they had espoused. This conduct doubtless grieved, but did not dismay Wycliffe. Not an iota of heart or hope did he abate therefore. Nay, he chose this moment to make a forward movement, and to aim more terrible blows at the papacy than any he had yet dealt it. Chapter 12. Wycliffe's Appeal to Parliament. Parliament meets. Wycliffe appears and demands a sweeping reform. His propositions touching the monastic orders, the Church's temporalities, transubstantiation, his growing boldness. His views find an echo in Parliament. The persecuting edict repealed. The Parliament met on the 19th of November, 1382. Wycliffe could now prosecute his appeal to the king against the sentence of the University Court, condemning his 12 propositions. But the prelates had been beforehand with him. They had inveigled the sovereign to lending them the sword of the state to wield it at will against Wycliffe, and against all who should doubt the tremendous mystery of transubstantiation. Well, they might burn him tomorrow, but he lived today, and the doors of Parliament stood open. Wycliffe made haste to enter with his appeal and complaint. The hierarchy had secretly accused him to the king. He openly arraigned them before the estates of the realm. The complaint presented by Wycliffe touched on 4 heads, and on each it demanded a very sweeping measure of reform. The first grievance to be abated or abolished was the monastic orders. The reformer demanded that they should be released from the unnatural, immoral vow which made them the scandal of the Church and the pests of society. Since Jesus shed his blood to free the Church, said Wycliffe, I demand its freedom. I demand that everyone may leave these gloomy walls, the convents, within the tyrannical law which the tyrannical law prevails, and embrace a simple and peaceful life under the open vault of heaven. The second part of the complaint had reference to the temporalities of the Church, the corruption and inefficiency of the clergy. Wycliffe traced largely to their enormous wealth. That the clergy themselves would surrender these overgrown revenues he did not expect. He called, therefore, for the interference of the state, holding, despite the opposite doctrine promulgated by the priests, that both the property and persons of the priesthood were under the jurisdiction of the king. Magistracy, he affirms, is God's ordinance. And he remarks that the Apostle Paul, who putteth all men in subjection to kings, taketh out never a one. And analogous to this was the third part of the paper, which related to the tithes and offerings. Let these, said Wycliffe, be remodeled. Let tithes and offerings be on a scale which shall be amply sufficient for the support of the recipients in the discharge of their sacred duties, but not such as to minister to their luxury and pride. And if a priest shall be found to be indolent or vicious, let neither tithe nor offering be given him. I demand, he said, that the poor inhabitants of our towns and villages be not constrained to furnish a worldly priest, often a vicious man and a heretic, with the means of satisfying his ostentation, his gluttony, and his licentiousness, of buying a showy horse, costly saddles, bridles and tinkling bells, rich garments and soft furs, while they see the wives and children of their neighbors dying of hunger. The last part of the paper went deeper. It touched on doctrine, and on that doctrine which occupies a central place in the Romish system, transubstantiation. His own views on the dogma he did not particularly define in this appeal to Parliament, though he did so a little while after, before the Convocation. He contented himself with craving liberty to have the true doctrine of the Eucharist, as given by Christ and all his apostles, taught throughout England in his Trialogus, which was composed about this time. He takes a luminous view of the dogma of transubstantiation. Its effects, he believed, were peculiarly mischievous and far-extending. Not only was it an error which enfeebled the understanding of the man who embraced it, and shook his confidence in the testimony of his senses, and so prepared the way for any absurdity or error, however much in opposition to reason or even to sense. The doctrine of the real presence, understood in a corporal sense, he declares to be the offering of Satan, whom he pictures as reasoning thus while inventing it. Should I once so far beguile the faithful of the Church by the aid of Antichrist, my vicegerent, as to persuade them to deny that this sacrament is bread, and to induce them to regard it as merely an accident, there will be nothing then which I will not bring them to receive, since there can be nothing more opposite to the Scriptures or to common discernment. Let the life of a prelate be then what it may be. Let him be guilty of luxury, simony, or murder. The people may be led to believe that he is really no such man. Nay, they may then be persuaded to admit that the Pope is infallible, at least with respect to matters of Christian faith, and that, inasmuch as he is known by the name of Most Holy Father, he is, of course, free from sin. It thus appears, says Vaughan, commenting on the above, that the object of Wycliffe was to restore the mind of man to the legitimate guidance of reason and of the senses in the study of Holy Writ, and in judging of every Christian institute, and that if the doctrine of transubstantiation proved peculiarly obnoxious to him, it was because that dogma was seen as in the most direct opposition to this generous design. To him it appeared that while the authority of the Church was so far submitted as to involve the adoption of this monstrous tenet, no limit could possibly be assigned to the schemes of clerical imposture and oppression. The enemies of the Reformer must have been confounded by this bold attack. They had persuaded themselves that the hour was come when Wickliffe must yield. Hereford, Repington, Ashton, all his friends, one after the other, had reconciled themselves to the hierarchy. The priest waited to see Wickliffe come forward, last of all, and bow his majestic head, and then they would lead him about in chains as a trophy of their victory, and a proof of the complete suppression of the movement of reform. He comes forward, but not to retract, not even to apologize, but with heart which grows only the stouter as his years increase and his enemies multiply, to reiterate his charges and again proclaim in the face of the whole nation the corruption, tyranny, and errors of the hierarchy. His sentiments found an echo in the Commons, and Parliament repealed the persecuting edict which the priests and the king had surreptitiously passed. Thus the gain remained with Wickliffe. Chapter 13. Wickliffe before Convocation, and the Roman Curia by letter. Convocation at Oxford, Wycliffe cited. Arraigned on the question of transubstantiation, Wycliffe maintains and reiterates the teaching of his whole life. He arraigns the judges. They are dismayed. Wycliffe retires unmolested, returns to Lutterworth, cited by Urban VI to Rome, unable to go, sends a letter, a faithful admonition, seen in the Vatican, Christ's and Antichrist's portraits. Baffled before the Parliament, the primate turned to Convocation. Here he could more easily reckon on a subservient court. Courtenay had taken care to assemble a goodly number of the clergy to give elat to the trial, and to be the spectators, as he fondly hoped, of the victory that awaited him. There were, besides the primate, 6 bishops, many doctors in divinity, and a host of inferior clergy. The concourse was swelled by the dignitaries and youth of Oxford. The scene where the trial took place must have recalled many memories to Wickliffe, which could not but deeply stir him. It was now 40 years since he had entered Oxford as a scholar. These halls had witnessed the toils of his youth and the labors of his manhood. Here had the most brilliant of his achievements been performed. Here had his name been mentioned with honor. And here his renown as a man of erudition and genius not formed the least constituent in the glory of his university. But this day Oxford opened her venerable gates to receive him in a new character. He came to be tried, perchance to be condemned, and, if the judges were able, to be delivered over to the civil power and punished as a heretic. The issue of the affair might be that the same Oxford which had borrowed a luster from his name would be lit up with the flames of his martyrdom. The indictment turned especially upon transubstantiation. Did he affirm or deny that cardinal doctrine of the Church? The reformer raised his venerable head in presence of the vast assembly. His eyes sought out Courtenay, the bishop, on whom he fixed a steady and searching gaze, and proceeded. In this, his last address before any court, he retracts nothing. He modifies nothing. He reiterates and confirms the whole teaching of his life on the question of the Eucharist. His address abounded in distinctions after the manner of that scholastic age, but it extorted praise for its unrivaled acuteness even from those who dissented from it. Throughout it, Wickliffe unmistakably condemns the tenet of transubstantiation, affirming that the bread still continues bread, and that there is no fleshly presence of Christ in the sacrament, nor other presence save a sacramental and spiritual one. Wickliffe had defended himself with a rare acuteness, and with a courage yet more rare. But acquittal he will neither crave nor accept from such a court. In one of those transformations which it is given to only majestic moral natures to effect, he mounts the judgment seat, and places his judges at the bar. Smitten in their conscience, they sat chained to their seats, deprived of the power to rise and go away, although the words of the bold reformer must have gone like burning arrows to their heart. They were the heretics, said he, who affirmed that the sacrament was an accident without a subject. Why did they propagate such errors? Why? Because, like the priests of Baal, they wanted to vend their masses. With whom, ye think? With whom, think you, he asked in closing, are you contending? With an old man on the brink of the grave? No, with truth. truth which is stronger than you and will overcome you." With these words he turned to leave the court. His enemies had not power to stop him. Like his divine master at Nazareth, says de Bigny, he passed through the midst of them. Leaving Oxford, he retired to his cure at Lutterworth. Wycliffe must bear testimony at Rome also. It was Pope Urban, not knowing what he did, who arranged that the voice of this great witness, before becoming finally silent, should be heard speaking from the 7 hills. One day about this time, as he was toiling with his pen in his quiet rectory, for his activity increased as his infirmities multiplied, and the night drew on in which he would not work, he received a summons from the pontiff to repair to Rome, for answer for his heresy before the papal see. Had he gone thither, he certainly would never have returned. But that was not the consideration that weighed with Wycliffe. The hand of God had laid an arrest upon him. He had had a shock of palsy, and had he attempted a journey so toilsome, he would have died on the way long before he could have reached the gates of the pontifical city. But though he could not go to Rome in person, he could go by letter, and thus the ends of Providence, if not the ends of Urban, would be equally served. The pontiff and his conclave and, in short, all Christendom were to have another warning, another call to repentance, addressed to them before the reformer should descend to the tomb. John Wycliffe sat down in his rectory to speak, across intervening mountains and seas, to Urban of Rome. Then the epistle of the rector of Lutterworth to the pontiff of Christendom, nothing can be imagined keener in its satire, yet nothing could have been more Christian and faithful in its spirit. Assuming Urban to be what Urban held himself to be, Wycliffe went on to say that there was no one before whom he could so joyfully appear as before Christ's vicar, for by no one could he expect Christ's law to be more revered, or Christ's gospel to be more loved. At no tribunal could he expect greater equity than that before which he now stood, and therefore, if he had strayed from the gospel, he was sure here to have his error proved to him, and the path of truth pointed out. The vicar of Christ, he quietly assumes, does not affect the greatness of this world. Oh, no, he leaves its pomp and vanities to worldly men, and contenting himself with the lowly estate of him who, while on earth, had not where to lay his head, he seeks no glory save the glory of resembling his master. The worldly lordship he is compelled to bear is, he is sure, an unwelcome burden, of which he is fain to be rid. The Holy Father ceases not, doubtless, to exhort all his priests throughout all Christendom to follow herein his own example, and to feed from the bread of life the flocks committed to their care. The Reformer closes by reiterating his willingness, if in aught he had erred, to be meekly amended, if needs be, by death. We can easily imagine the scowling faces amid which this letter was opened and read in the Vatican. Had Wycliffe indulged in argumentative terms, those to whom this epistle was addressed would have felt only assailed. As it was, they were arraigned. They felt themselves standing at the bar of the Reformer. With severe and truthful hand, Wycliffe draws the portrait of him whose servants Urban and his cardinals profess to be, and holding it up in full in their sight, he asks, "Is this your likeness? Is this the poverty in which you live? Is this the humility you cultivate?" With the monuments of their pride on every hand, their palaces, their estates, their gay robes, their magnificent equipages, their luxurious tables, their tyranny, the scourge, and their lives the scandal of Christendom. They dared not say, "This is our likeness." Thus they were condemned. But it was Christ who condemned them. This was all that Urban had gained by summoning Wickliffe before him. He had but erected a pulpit on the 7 hills, from the lofty elevation of which the English reformer was able to proclaim, in the hearing of all the nations of Europe, that Rome was the Antichrist. Wow, that is great. I love it. I'm going to have to post that as a separate post on my blog. That is so beautifully done. Okay, well, we're running out of time. And next time will be chapter 14. Wycliffe's last days. He's not done working yet. And like I said, book 2 of the history of Protestantism is entirely on the life of Wickliffe, and very deserving of his own book, of the 24 books in the volume that are the history of Protestantism. That Wickliffe gets his own book is very deserving and very fitting that he should. And we're not done with Wycliffe's life yet. We have 2 more chapters to go, which I'm sure we will get done next time. That will probably be Monday, because I have other chores I have to take care of tomorrow. But I will have a good rerun here for you, so that you'll have a good meat to listen to tomorrow during this time slot. Let's see. Annette from PA Busy Bee says, I have been sharing your contact and times and show names on various platforms, seeing new listeners. And thank you so much for that, Busy Bee. We need that. First Amendment Radio needs it so much. I've tried to spend, I tried to spend all my money for the last couple of months on advertising on Facebook, and I saw some little but not much out of it. And I just don't have any more money to spend. I had to stop it because when it's getting to where it costs more to do the work here on First Amendment Radio and Cross the Border and Prophecy Reformation, then I have to pull back, 'cause I have to eat and pay my bills. And now I'm taking what little living I have to do that and spending it on to support the work. It just should not be. So I guess my appeal is to the Lord for support here, and for people, and for that we need more listeners and more people being blessed by it. And if this is not a blessing to the Lord, if I'm not doing what he wants me to do, then then I need other directions or something. I don't know what, or just to suffer through it. I'm happy to do whatever God wants me to do, and so far I'm just suffering through it. And that's about it. Okay, well, I do have a lot of work to do, and I have run out of time. Make sure you can buy a copy of this, the entire thing, or one at a time. It's in 5 volumes, and they're all cheap, less than, I think, about $30. I'm not sure. I think they're like less than $25 a piece, which is not bad for a 500 or 600 page volume in paperback. Everything has gone up in price. So what can we do? And we make a few dollars off it, not very much. So if you're looking for a place to for tithes and offerings, we certainly need them here at First Amendment Radio. So please pray for us if you cannot help us monetarily, and share. Not many people are sharing the things on my blog at nicholasarthur.wordpress.com, because I can look and I can see how many people are seeing them, and not many. The page has really gone down and not getting very, very many views lately. Over the last year or so, things have really fallen off. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's historicism itself. seems to be very, very unpopular. And I mean, not only just unknown, but very unpopular. And it is much maligned by those that are popular these days. And those are those that are pushing the futurist, what do you call it? The Christian Zionist form of I am coming into the end of my energy here at the end of 2 hours. Okay. Would be nice to get an email. I'm going to look into that. And I guess I'm going to say thank you all for showing up for today, for your support, for those few of you who are supporting the work that's done here. Do take advantage of firstamendmentradio.net on your smart device, .net/Moby. And you can listen to First Amendment Radio throughout the day when you're working or traveling. That's the whole purpose, to put the kingdom of God first, in the forefront of your life, and to make sure that you are the wheat among the tares, because that is really what it takes. Well, I am now running out of time. May the Almighty bless you all as you travel on the narrow way that leads to life. Love you all, and I will see you next time. Hi, I'm Nicholas Arthur, and I'd like to introduce you to my latest book, Reformed Prophecy Interpretation, an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism in the 21st century. As with primitive biblical Christianity, historicism is the method of prophecy interpretation restored with the advent of the Protestant Reformation, and had become so widely held that for a long time it was called the Protestant view. My book is not so much about the errors of dispensationalism or amillennialism. Rather, it is about the historicist alternative to understanding many of the same passages from the vantage point of prophecy fulfilled in history. For those that desire more than mere hypotheses, bolstered with conjectured speculation, those who require explicit biblical exegesis and verified historical fulfillment, and are not willing to accept speculation as anything other than what it is, speculation, not truth. This book is for you. Over the last century, this method of interpretation has become almost completely forgotten, even by Protestants, in the face of a method that is based almost entirely on future speculation, rather than fulfilled prophecy in history. In my book, I examine the reasons for this and investigate some of the prophecy which has been fulfilled in the interim, as well as present an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism to the 21st century. If you're interested in a copy of my book, you can go to my website, crosstheborder.org, and get more information there, or you may also find it at Amazon. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. firstamendmentradio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. firstamendmentradio.net/Moby. No download or app necessary.